The wind never asked for permission on the western plains. It scraped across the dry earth, rattling the walls of a small, struggling farm where Ezekiel Brown lived with a woman the world refused to see kindly. In the late years of the 19th century, survival was hard enough, but judgment was harder. Every morning, Ezekiel walked a step ahead of his wife, his shoulders tight, his eyes lowered whenever others stared at Maggie Brown. Her body was large, her presence impossible to hide, and in a land that valued toughness and pride, she became an easy target. Ezekiel laughed when others laughed. Sometimes he was the first to make the joke. To him, it felt harmless words thrown into the dust, gone with the wind. But words have weight, and silence can carry more pain than shouting ever could. Maggie bore it all quietly as the plains bore the sun. What Ezekiel never understood was this: a single cruel habit can shape a destiny. And the heart he mocked might one day become the only place he would ever find true love. Before we continue, take a moment to tell us where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you enjoy deep emotional stories from the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive. In the Wild West, love was a luxury few could afford. For Ezekiel Brown, marriage had never been a dream. It was a decision made out of necessity, like buying a mule or digging a deeper well before winter came. The land he worked was stubborn, dry, and unforgiving, much like the man himself. Every day demanded strength, endurance, and a willingness to bury emotion beneath duty. Ezekiel had been alone for a long time. His parents had died early, claimed by sickness and exhaustion, before they ever reached old age. The farm they left him was little more than a promise that never quite came true. Crops failed more often than they flourished. Money slipped through his fingers like sand. And in the evenings, when the sun sank low and the wind grew quiet, the loneliness pressed down on him harder than hunger ever had. The townsfolk noticed. A man without a wife was whispered about, pitied, sometimes mocked. A wife meant stability. It meant meals on the table, clothes mended, and a home that felt anchored rather than drifting apart. Ezekiel did not marry because his heart ached for companionship. He married because the world expected it and because he feared becoming invisible. That was how Maggie Brown entered his life. Maggie was not the woman men turned to stare at when she walked through town. She was broad-shouldered, full-bodied, with hands rough from work and eyes that seemed to carry too much patience. People spoke of her quietly, as if her size required discretion. Some were cruel enough to speak openly. Others simply looked away. When Ezekiel first considered her as a wife, he did so with calculation rather than feeling. She was kind. She was capable. She would work hard. And most importantly, no other man seemed eager to claim her. In his mind, that made the arrangement simple, safe. Maggie accepted his proposal with a soft nod and trembling hands. She had waited a long time for someone to choose her, not with passion or poetry, but with certainty. She told herself that certainty could grow into love. She told herself many things during those early days. Their wedding was small, almost forgettable. A few neighbors gathered, a brief blessing from Reverend Jonathan Miller. No music, no laughter that lasted longer than courtesy allowed. Ezekiel stood stiff beside his bride, already thinking about the work waiting for him back at the farm. Maggie noticed. She always noticed, but she said nothing. Marriage changed little for Ezekiel, at least on the surface. The days remained long and brutal. The nights remained quiet. What changed was the presence of someone else in his space, someone who moved carefully around him, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance of his temper. Maggie rose before dawn each morning. She cooked cleaned, hauled water and tended to whatever chores Ezekiel left unfinished. She spoke gently, even when he answered sharply. She smiled at him when he returned home weary and irritated, though her own body ached from labor just as hard. Ezekiel rarely thanked her. At first, his indifference seemed manageable. Maggie told herself that men like him showed love through silence, through provision, rather than words. But soon the silence began to cut deeper. Ezekiel did not just ignore her, he distanced himself as if her presence embarrassed him. In town, he walked ahead of her. At gatherings, he left her standing alone. When others stared or smirked, Ezekiel laughed along, eager to separate himself from the object of their ridicule. Each laugh felt to Maggie like a door quietly closing. He never raised his hand to her. He never shouted. His cruelty was quieter than that, wrapped in jokes delivered with half smiles dismissed as harmless. But each remark chipped away at something fragile inside her. Maggie had known hardship before marriage. She had known hunger loss and the sting of being overlooked, but being unseen by the man she called her husband was a different kind of pain. It was sharper, more personal. Still, she endured. She believed endurance was a virtue. Women of the West were praised for it. Endure the land, endure the weather, endure the men. Maggie took pride in how much she could carry without complaint. Ezekiel, meanwhile, told himself stories to justify his behavior. He told himself he was merely honest. He told himself Maggie was too sensitive. He told himself that life had hardened him and that softness had no place in survival. Most of all, he told himself that what he felt or didn't feel was normal. But beneath those justifications lived something darker: shame. Every time he looked at Maggie, he was reminded of his own failures, his failing crops, his failing pride, his failing dreams. Her body, solid and unyielding, became a symbol of everything he could not control. And, instead of facing that truth, he mocked it. Weeks turned into months. Seasons shifted. Maggie's hope, once fragile but present, began to fade. She learned to speak less, to smile less, to exist quietly within the walls of a marriage that offered shelter but no warmth. And yet, even as the distance between them grew, something unspoken lingered in the air, something unresolved, a tension that neither of them knew how to name. Because while Ezekiel believed he had chosen the safest path, he did not yet understand the cost of a loveless union. And Maggie, though worn and wounded, still carried a heart capable of giving far more than she had ever been asked for. What neither of them realized was this: the ground beneath their marriage was already beginning to crack. And when it finally broke, it would force Ezekiel Brown to confront a truth he had spent his life running from. In the frontier towns scattered across the plains, cruelty rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived wrapped in laughter, disguised as humor, softened by familiarity. Ezekiel Brown learned early that a joke could wound without leaving a mark, and he learned how to use that lesson well. It began with small remarks. Comments tossed into conversation like dry twigs into a fire, meant to spark laughter, and nothing more. At least that was how Ezekiel explained it to himself. When Maggie bent to lift a sack of grain, he muttered something about the earth pulling her closer than it did other women. When she paused to catch her breath, he smiled thinly and said she ought to slow down anyway, helped keep her figure where it already was. The men around him chuckled. Some laughed too loudly. Others laughed because silence felt awkward. Ezekiel laughed with them, relief flickering across his face as the attention shifted away from his failing farm, his thin wallet, his quiet desperation. Maggie heard every word. She heard them even when she pretended not to. She heard them when she washed dishes at the edge of the room, when she stood behind Ezekiel at the general store, when she walked beside him through town and felt his pace quicken, as if distance could erase embarrassment. At first, she told herself that men spoke roughly by nature, that the West hardened tongues as much as it hardened hands. She told herself that Ezekiel did not mean harm, that he simply did not know how his words landed. But the truth settled slowly and painfully, he knew. The laughter always came easier when she was near. The jokes always found their way back to her body, her presence, her inability to disappear. And when Maggie dared to meet Ezekiel's eyes afterward, she found no apology there. Only impatience, sometimes irritation, as if her hurt inconvenienced him. Caleb Turner noticed too. Caleb had always been quick with his tongue, sharper than most. He had the kind of confidence that grew from watching others stumble. When Ezekiel made a remark about Maggie one afternoon outside the saloon, Caleb leaned into it without hesitation, adding a cruel flourish that sent a ripple of laughter through the group. Maggie stood still, her hands clenched at her sides. Ezekiel did nothing to stop it. That night, as they sat across from each other at the small wooden table, Maggie waited for Ezekiel to speak, to say something, anything that might soften what had happened. The oil lamp flickered between them, casting shadows that made his face look harder than usual. He said nothing. The silence stretched until Maggie finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "Do I shame you that much?" Ezekiel stiffened. He did not look at her. "You're reading too much into it," he replied. "People joke. It don't mean anything." "It means something to me," she said. He exhaled sharply, irritation rising. "You can't expect folks to tiptoe around you forever." Maggie lowered her eyes. She had no answer for that, no words strong enough to defend herself without sounding foolish. So she did what she had learned to do. Best she swallowed the pain and carried it quietly. Days passed. Then weeks. The remarks continued, sometimes subtle, sometimes sharp enough to sting immediately. Maggie grew quieter, her laughter faded, her movements slowed, as if she were learning how to take up less space in the world. Ezekiel noticed the change, but he misunderstood it. He thought her silence meant acceptance. He thought her lowered gaze meant peace. In his mind, the problem had resolved itself. Life moved on, and so did he. But silence, when stretched too thin, begins to rot. Maggie stopped joining him in town unless absolutely necessary. She lingered at the edges of gatherings, offering help in kitchens rather than conversation in circles. When Ezekiel spoke, she listened. When he joked, she smiled faintly. When he mocked, she said nothing at all. Inside, something vital began to fracture. She remembered a younger version of herself, one who had believed marriage would bring safety, if not romance. One who had imagined evenings spent sharing warmth, if not passion. That woman felt distant now, like a stranger she barely recognized. Ezekiel, meanwhile, felt a growing restlessness he could not name. Maggie's quiet unsettled him. It robbed him of the easy target that had once deflected attention from his own inadequacies. Her silence forced him to sit with himself more often than he liked. One evening, after a long day of failed labor, he made another remark sharper than usual, edged with frustration. The words landed between them like a dropped plate. Maggie did not respond. She simply stood, gathered the dishes, and walked out of the room. Something about the finality of that movement made Ezekiel pause. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his chest, but pride smothered it quickly. He told himself she would return. She always did. She did return, but changed. From that day on, Maggie spoke only when necessary. She no longer sought Ezekiel's attention. She no longer tried to please him beyond her duties. Her kindness remained, but it was distant now, guarded. The house grew colder. Ezekiel began to feel the weight of that cold in unexpected ways. The jokes stopped earning laughter from him. The town's cruelty no longer distracted him as easily. And yet, instead of examining his role in the growing divide, he doubled down, convinced that admitting fault would mean surrendering something he could not afford to lose: control. What Ezekiel failed to understand was this: every word he had thrown so carelessly into the air had settled somewhere deep inside Maggie, and though she carried them silently, they were shaping her in ways neither of them could yet see. The plains outside remained vast and indifferent, stretching endlessly beneath the sky. But within the walls of their small farmhouse, something fragile was reaching its breaking point. And when it broke, it would not do so quietly. There are people who move through the world unseen, not because they are small, but because no one has learned how to look at them. Margaret Brown became one of those people. Each morning, Maggie woke before the light reached the horizon. The house was quiet, then wrapped in a thin, fragile peace that never lasted past dawn. She moved carefully, mindful of every sound, as if the walls themselves might object to her presence. She lit the stove, kneaded dough, boiled water, hauled from the well the night before. Her body bore the weight of the work without complaint, though every joint ached beneath the strain. She did these things not because Ezekiel asked her to, but because someone had to. The land demanded constant tending, and Ezekiel's attention drifted easily toward his frustrations rather than his responsibilities. Maggie filled the gaps without being asked. She always had. By the time Ezekiel emerged from the bedroom, the day had already begun. Food waited on the table. Clean clothes rested neatly folded. Tools were laid out where he would need them. Maggie offered a quiet greeting, her voice gentle, her eyes careful. Ezekiel answered with a nod, sometimes nothing at all. To an outsider, their home might have appeared orderly, functional, respectable even. But beneath that surface lived a deep absence, a hollow where warmth should have been. Maggie felt it most acutely in the moments when she reached for connection and found only air. She tried in small ways to bridge the distance. She cooked his favorite meals when she could afford the ingredients. She remembered details about his day, asked questions about his work. She sat beside him in the evenings, even when he stared past her eyes, fixed on worries she could not touch. Each attempt met the same fate: quiet dismissal. The absence of cruelty would have been easier to endure than this constant erasure. Being mocked wounded her pride. Being ignored wounded something deeper. In town, Maggie learned how to make herself useful without being visible. She helped other women with sewing and cooking. She listened more than she spoke. When someone addressed her kindly, she answered with gratitude that surprised even herself. Kindness had become rare enough to feel extraordinary. Some women pitied her, others avoided her, afraid that association might draw unwanted attention. Maggie did not blame them. Survival in the West required careful choices. At home, Ezekiel rarely noticed how much she carried. When he did, he assumed it was simply her nature. He had grown accustomed to her reliability, the way one grows accustomed to gravity, only aware of it when it fails. Maggie never complained about the work. What weighed on her was the quiet certainty that no one truly saw her effort, her endurance, her worth. She existed in service, not partnership, in function, not affection. There were nights when the loneliness pressed so hard against her chest that breathing felt difficult. She would lie awake beside Ezekiel, listening to his steady breathing, wondering how two people could share a bed and remain worlds apart. Sometimes she reached out her fingers, hovering inches from his arm, before retreating back into herself. She learned to expect nothing. And yet something inside her refused to die completely. A small stubborn part of her still believed that being seen might one day be possible, that love, though absent now, might grow from patience. It was that fragile hope that kept her moving forward, even as it thinned with each passing day. Ezekiel noticed changes he could not name. Maggie spoke less. Her laughter disappeared entirely. She no longer tried to fill silences with words. Instead, she moved through the house like a shadow, present necessary but unnoticed. When she stopped walking beside him in town and chose instead to linger behind, he felt a flicker of relief. Fewer stares, fewer jokes. He told himself this arrangement suited them both, but sometimes in quiet moments, an unexpected unease crept in. He would glance around the house half expecting her not to be there. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Maggie, meanwhile, began to retreat inward. She found comfort in routine, in the predictability of tasks that did not judge her. She stopped imagining a future that included affection. Instead, she focused on survival, on enduring the present without breaking. One afternoon, while working alone in the field, Maggie stumbled and fell hard against the dry ground. Pain shot through her side, sharp and sudden. She lay there for a moment, staring at the sky, the vast blue stretching endlessly above her. No one saw her fall. She pushed herself up slowly, brushing dust from her dress, and continued working. That was how things were done. Pain was acknowledged privately, then set aside. That evening, Ezekiel commented that she moved more slowly than usual. His tone held irritation rather than concern. "I'm fine," Maggie replied, because that was the answer she had learned to give. But she was not fine. Something inside her was growing heavy, heavier than her body, heavier than the work. It was the weight of being unseen, unvalued, unclaimed in every way that mattered. As the days shortened and the nights grew colder, Maggie felt herself changing. The hope she once guarded so carefully began to dull, replaced by a quiet resignation. She no longer imagined Ezekiel loving her. She no longer imagined being loved at all. What she did not yet realize was that her endurance, stretched too far, was approaching its limit. And when a person who has carried everything alone finally falters, the consequences can be far greater than anyone expects. Ezekiel would soon learn that the woman he had failed to see had been holding their world together all along, and without her strength, everything would begin to unravel. It was late afternoon when Maggie first crossed paths with Eliza Hartwell, though neither of them knew then how much that meeting would matter. The sun hung low over the plains, painting the dirt road in shades of copper and gold. Maggie had come to town with a short-list flower lamp oil, a length of thread, and the familiar intention of finishing quickly and returning home before anyone could linger on her too long. Eliza stood outside the general store, her back straight, her hands folded calmly at her waist. She was a widow, everyone knew that much. Leather husband had died years earlier, taken by a fever that swept through the region without mercy. Since then, Eliza lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, sustaining herself through sewing and quiet trade. She spoke little, but when she did, people listened, not because she demanded attention, but because she offered something rare respect. Maggie nearly passed her by without a word. That was her habit now, to make herself small to avoid drawing notice. But Eliza turned and met her eyes. "Good afternoon," Eliza said gently. The words startled Maggie more than any insult ever had. She hesitated, then answered, "Afternoon." Eliza smiled, not the kind of smile that measured or judged, but one that simply welcomed. "It's warm today," she added, as if stating an ordinary truth. "Yes," Maggie replied, unsure why her chest felt suddenly tight. They stood together in silence for a moment, two women watching the slow movement of town life. Eliza did not look Maggie up and down. She did not glance away. Her gaze rested easily, comfortably, as though Maggie's presence required no adjustment. "You're Margaret Brown, aren't you?" Eliza asked. Maggie nodded. "Most folks call me Maggie. I'm Eliza," she said. "I've seen you around. You keep busy." It was an observation, not a judgment. Maggie did not know how to respond. No one had ever acknowledged her efforts so plainly before. They spoke only briefly that day, exchanging a few simple words before Maggie continued inside the store. But something lingered after the strange, unsettling feeling of having been seen. In the weeks that followed, Maggie noticed Eliza more often. Sometimes they shared space in silence. Other times, a few words passed between them. Eliza asked about Maggie's day. She listened when Maggie answered. When Maggie hesitated, Eliza did not push. It was subtle, unassuming, and yet it began to change something Maggie had long believed to be fixed. Eliza treated her as a person of substance. One afternoon, Eliza invited Maggie to sit with her while she mended a dress. Maggie's first instinct was refusal. She did not feel worthy of rest, let alone company. But Eliza's tone carried no pressure, only an open door. So Maggie sat. As Eliza worked, she spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the difficulty of keeping fabric clean in the dust, the way silence could sometimes be comforting. Maggie listened, then slowly began to speak herself. She spoke of the farm, of the work, of the endless days. She did not speak of Ezekiel. Not at first. Eliza did not ask. She seemed to understand that some truths needed time before they could be trusted to another person. Ezekiel noticed Maggie's absences before he noticed her change. She lingered longer in town. She returned home later in the afternoons. At first, he assumed inefficiency. Then irritation crept in. "What takes you so long?" he asked one evening, his voice edged with impatience. "I stopped to talk," Maggie replied quietly. "To who?" he asked. "Eliza Hartwell." Ezekiel frowned. "That widow, yes." He said nothing more, but something tightened inside him. The idea of Maggie speaking freely to someone else unsettled him in ways he did not understand. He told himself it was foolish. Maggie was not going anywhere. She had no reason to, and yet he began to watch her more closely. Maggie's posture shifted subtly over time. She stood a little straighter. Her voice gained a steadiness it had long lacked. She did not rush quite so quickly to appease Ezekiel's moods. These were small changes, barely noticeable, but they struck Ezekiel as unfamiliar. One evening, he made a joke at her expense, expecting the usual quiet acceptance. Maggie met his eyes. She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply said, "I don't find that funny." The words were calm, measured, and they unsettled him more than anger ever could. Ezekiel scoffed, brushing it off. But later, alone with his thoughts, he replayed the moment again and again. Something had shifted. He felt it like a hairline crack beneath his feet. Maggie, meanwhile, found herself drawn toward Eliza's presence. In that quiet companionship, she rediscovered pieces of herself she thought long gone. Eliza never spoke of changing Maggie's life. She offered no advice about marriage or endurance. She simply treated Maggie as someone whose thoughts mattered. That, more than anything, awakened Maggie's awareness. She began to recognize the difference between kindness and obligation, between being needed and being valued. The realization was both comforting and painful. Comforting because it reminded her she was not broken. Painful because it revealed how long she had lived without that knowledge. One afternoon, while sharing tea, Eliza spoke softly. Sometimes she said, "We stay where we are because we believe it's all we deserve." Maggie's breath caught. Eliza did not look at her when she spoke those words. She did not need to. That night, Maggie lay awake beside Ezekiel, staring into the dark. Eliza's words echoed in her mind. She thought of the years she had given, the silence she had endured, the smallness she had learned, and for the first time she wondered, truly wondered, what it might mean to be more than invisible. Ezekiel sensed the distance growing, though he could not name it. He felt Maggie slipping from the familiar role she had always played. It frightened him, and fear for a man like Ezekiel often disguised itself as resentment. He told himself Eliza was filling Maggie's head with foolish ideas. He told himself this would pass, but it did not. Because once a person has been truly seen, they cannot return to being unseen, not without losing something essential. And Maggie Brown was beginning slowly and quietly to open her eyes. The drought came quietly at first, as most disasters did on the plains. A week without rain turned into 2, then 3. The sky remained an unbroken blue, hard and merciless, offering no relief. The soil cracked open like old wounds, and the crops that Ezekiel Brown had pinned his hopes on began to wither under the relentless sun. Ezekiel watched it all with a tightening jaw and a growing sense of dread. Each morning he walked the field's boots sinking into dust where soft earth should have been. He knelt, scooped dry soil into his palm, and let it fall through his fingers, knowing exactly what it meant. No rain meant no harvest. No harvest meant debt. And debt in the Wild West was a slow death. The pressure weighed on him heavily. He slept poorly, woke early, and carried his anger like a second skin. He cursed the land, the sky, and the luck that never seemed to favor him. And when those curses found no answer, they turned inward, then outward. They turned toward Maggie. Maggie felt the shift immediately. Ezekiel's silence sharpened. His movements grew abrupt. Where he once ignored her, he now snapped at small things: the way she folded a shirt, the way she stirred a pot, the way she paused to rest her aching back. "Everything's slowing down," he muttered one evening, watching her cross the room. "Even you." Maggie said nothing. She had learned when silence was safer than defense. With the drought came more work. Maggie hauled water from farther distances as nearby wells ran dry. She rationed food, carefully stretching meals so they would last. She took on tasks Ezekiel abandoned in his frustration, knowing the land did not care who completed the work, only that it was done. Her body bore the cost. By late summer, exhaustion etched itself into her face. Her hands trembled when she lifted heavy buckets. Her breath came shorter, shallower. Still, she pushed on. There was no other choice. Survival did not pause for weariness. Ezekiel noticed, but not with concern. He saw only inefficiency where once there had been endless endurance. His resentment grew not because Maggie failed him, but because she reminded him of how close he was to failing himself. The town felt the drought as well. Whispers of foreclosure passed between men at the general store. Families tightened their belts. Tension crept into conversations, turning neighbors into competitors. Caleb Turner, ever eager to find fault, remarked one afternoon that Ezekiel's fields looked worse than most. "Maybe the land's tired," he said with a grin. "Or maybe it's just given up." Ezekiel laughed stiffly, though the words struck deep. He glanced at Maggie, standing quietly behind him, and something bitter rose in his chest. The same bitterness that had fueled his mockery before now found a sharper edge. That night, after a long day of failed labor, Ezekiel lashed out. "You ever think maybe you're part of the problem?" he asked suddenly, his voice low but cutting. Maggie froze. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. "Everything feels heavy," he said. "This place, this life, you." The words landed like a blow. Maggie swallowed hard. "I'm doing everything I can." "I know," Ezekiel replied, his tone edged with frustration rather than gratitude. "That's just it." She did not understand then what he meant. Only later would she realize that her endurance had become a mirror he could no longer stand to face. The drought dragged on. Maggie grew thinner in spirit, if not in body. Sleep no longer restored her. Pain lingered in her side from the fall she had taken weeks earlier, but she said nothing. Pain had become an expected companion. One afternoon, while hauling water under the blazing sun, her vision blurred. The bucket slipped from her hand, spilling precious water into the dirt. Maggie dropped to her knees, heart-pounding breath coming in shallow gasps. For a moment, the world tilted. She remained there longer than she should have, waiting for the dizziness to pass. When she finally stood, her legs trembled beneath her weight. She returned home slowly, each step deliberate. Ezekiel noticed the spilled bucket and scowled. "Careless," he muttered. Maggie did not respond. That night, she did not finish her meal. She pushed the plate away quietly, claiming fatigue. Ezekiel barely looked up. The distance between them widened, not with dramatic arguments or raised voices, but with a quiet accumulation of neglect. Maggie's strength, once so reliable, began to fail in small, dangerous ways. And Ezekiel, consumed by fear and pride, remained blind to the warning signs. Eliza noticed. When Maggie arrived in town days later, her steps were slower, her face pale beneath the sun. Eliza watched her, carefully concerned, shadowing her calm expression. "You're carrying too much," Eliza said softly. Maggie smiled faintly. "It's just the season." But even as she spoke, her hands trembled. The drought was not just claiming the land, it was stripping away illusions. The illusion that endurance was endless. The illusion that cruelty carried no cost. The illusion that Ezekiel could keep everything from falling apart by sheer force of will. As summer bled into early autumn, with no relief in sight, something inside Maggie finally reached its limit. And when it did, the consequences would be impossible to ignore. Because the land was not the only thing cracking under the weight of the sun. The morning it happened began like any other, quiet, pale, and already warm. The sun climbed steadily unchallenged by clouds, and the air carried that familiar stillness that had settled over the plains since the rain stopped coming. Maggie rose before Ezekiel, her body stiff with fatigue, her side aching in a way she had learned to ignore. She moved through the house on instinct alone, lighting the stove, setting water to boil, measuring out the last of the flour with careful restraint. She told herself she would rest later. She always did. Outside, the fields waited brittle and unforgiving. Maggie stepped into the day with a bucket in each hand, the metal biting into her palms. The well was farther now, the nearer one reduced to a trickle days ago. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she kept moving, driven by the quiet certainty that stopping was not an option. Halfway back to the house, a sharp pain bloomed in her side, sudden and fierce. Maggie gasped, the bucket swinging wildly as her vision blurred. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet, the horizon bending and narrowing. She tried to steady herself to breathe through it, but her legs betrayed her. She fell hard. The buckets clattered away, water soaking into the dust as Maggie hit the ground on her side. Pain radiated through her ribs, stealing her breath. For a moment, she could not move. The sky above her stretched endlessly blue and indifferent, and she wondered briefly distantly how long she had been lying there. No one came. Ezekiel was in the far field, wrestling with a fence post that refused to stay upright. He did not hear the buckets fall. He did not see Maggie collapse. The land swallowed the sound just as it swallowed everything else. Maggie tried to push herself up. Her arms trembled, strength draining away faster than she could summon it. A wave of dizziness washed over her, darkening the edges of her vision. She let herself sink back into the dirt, breath, shallow, heart pounding. This time she did not rise again. It was hours later when Ezekiel returned to the house, frustration etched deep into his features. The fence remained unfinished. The fields looked worse than ever. His temper simmered dangerously close to the surface. He noticed the silence first. The house was too quiet. Maggie, he called, irritation already sharpening his voice. No answer. He stepped inside, scanning the room. The stove was cold. The table was empty. Unease crept in, subtle but persistent. He told himself she must be outside working as she always was. Then he saw the buckets. They lay tipped over near the path, water long since soaked into the ground. Ezekiel's breath caught. He dropped what he was carrying and moved quickly, his boots kicking up dust as he followed the path back toward the well. He found her lying on her side, face pale, eyes closed. For a moment, Ezekiel simply stared. The sight did not fit into his understanding of the world. Maggie was the constant, the enduring one. She did not fall. She did not stop. His mind resisted the truth even as his body reacted. "Maggie," he said, his voice rough. He knelt beside her, shaking her shoulder gently at first, then harder. Panic surged as she did not respond. He pressed his fingers to her neck, relief flooding him when he felt a faint pulse. She was alive, but barely. Ezekiel lifted her with an urgency he had never shown before, cradling her awkwardly as he carried her back toward the house. Her weight felt different now, not burdensome, but frightening, fragile. Inside, he laid her on the bed, his hands trembling as he tried to recall anything useful. He fetched water, dampened a cloth, pressed it to her forehead. He muttered her name again and again, as if repetition alone might pull her back. When Maggie finally stirred, her eyes fluttered open briefly. Confusion clouded her gaze. She tried to speak, but the words dissolved into a weak breath. "Don't," Ezekiel said quickly, his voice cracking. "Just rest." The word sounded foreign on his tongue. He sat beside her through the long afternoon and into the evening, watching every rise and fall of her chest. The house felt smaller, closer, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. Ezekiel's thoughts raced, colliding and scattering. He had not planned for this. As night fell, Maggie's breathing grew shallow again. She whimpered softly, a sound so unlike her usual quiet strength that it cut straight through him. Ezekiel found himself gripping the edge of the bed, knuckles white, fear settling deep in his bones. This was not exhaustion that would pass with sleep. This was something more, something dangerous. Memories surfaced uninvited. Maggie working late into the night. Maggie lifting heavy loads without complaint. Maggie swallowing her pain with practiced ease. He saw those moments now with a clarity that burned. How long had she been like this? The realization struck him hard. He did not know. He had not been paying attention. Hours passed. Ezekiel did not leave her side. He spoke to her in a low voice, words tumbling out without structure or intention. He told her to hold on. He told her she would be all right. He told her things he had never said before, things he was not sure she could hear. Near dawn, Maggie stirred again. Her eyes opened fully this time, dull with exhaustion. "You stayed," she whispered. Ezekiel swallowed. "Of course I stayed." She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing that answer. Then her eyes drifted closed again. Something shifted inside Ezekiel in that quiet hour before sunrise. Fear had stripped away his defenses, leaving him exposed to a truth he could no longer deny. The woman he had overlooked, mocked, and taken for granted was the only steady force in his life. And he had come dangerously close to losing her. As the first light crept through the window, Ezekiel realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, could return to the way it had been. Because once you see the cost of your cruelty, you cannot unsee it. And Ezekiel Brown was only beginning to understand the price he might have to pay. Night settled over the farm with a weight Ezekiel Brown had never felt before. The darkness pressed in from every side, thick and unyielding, broken only by the dim glow of the oil lamp beside the bed. Maggie lay still beneath the thin blanket, her breathing shallow, uneven, as if even air required effort. Ezekiel did not sleep. He sat in the wooden chair near the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly as though holding himself together by force alone. Every sound, the creak of the house, the distant cry of a night bird, the whisper of wind through dry grass felt amplified, but it was the silence between Maggie's breaths that terrified him most. He watched her chest rise, fall, rise again. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Ezekiel had faced hunger debt and the slow decay of a dying harvest without blinking, but this helpless waiting unraveled him. There was nothing he could fix with tools or stubborn resolve. No field to plow, no fence to mend. Just a woman lying still and the crushing realization that her strength had been carrying him all along. He leaned forward and gently wiped her forehead with a damp cloth. His touch was hesitant, unfamiliar, as if he feared doing harm simply by being near her. Maggie stirred faintly but did not wake. "You should have told me," he murmured, though he knew the words were hollow. He had never truly listened before. Why would she have believed he would now? As the hours passed, memories surfaced, uninvited and relentless. He remembered her hands, always busy, always worn. He remembered the way she stood back in town, letting others pass before her. He remembered the jokes he had made, the laughter he had chased, the ease with which he had traded her dignity for his own comfort. Each memory struck harder than the last. Ezekiel rose quietly and moved about the house, setting water to warm, preparing what little he could. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if sudden noise might shatter something fragile. He found himself glancing back at the bed, repeatedly reassured only by the faint movement beneath the blanket. At some point, exhaustion threatened to claim him. His body sagged, his vision blurred, but every time he closed his eyes, fear jolted him awake. He could not risk missing anything, not a change in her breathing, not a whispered word. Sometime after midnight, Maggie stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first. She frowned, slightly confusion crossing her features. Ezekiel was at her side in an instant. "Maggie," he said softly, "it's all right. I'm here." She studied his face as if seeing him for the first time. "You didn't go," she whispered. "No," he replied. "I'm not going." The words felt heavier than he expected, like a promise he had never learned how to keep. She closed her eyes again, but her brow remained tense. Ezekiel hesitated, then reached out, resting his hand lightly over hers. Her skin was warm, roughened by years of labor. She did not pull away. The silence between them stretched, but it was different now. Not empty, not sharp. It carried something tentative, fragile. Ezekiel sat like that for a long time, his hand still resting over hers, afraid that moving might break the moment. He listened to her breathing slower now, steadier. Each breath felt like a small mercy. As the night deepened, Ezekiel's thoughts turned inward. He saw himself clearly stripped of excuses. He had mocked her not because she deserved it, but because it shielded him from his own inadequacies. Every cruel remark had been a way to avoid looking at the man he feared he was. Poor, powerless, unremarkable. Maggie had never asked him to be more than he was. She had never demanded kindness. She had simply given quietly, endlessly. And he had taken it all without question. A sharp ache settled in his chest. Near dawn, Maggie stirred again, this time more fully awake. Her eyes found his, and something unreadable passed between them. "It hurts," she said softly. "I know," Ezekiel replied, his voice thick. "I'll get help when the sun comes up. I promise." She nodded faintly. "I didn't mean just my side." "I know," he said again, though he wasn't sure what he meant. He knew she was hurting in ways no medicine could touch. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Maggie whispered, "I thought, if I stopped moving, maybe it wouldn't matter." The words struck him harder than any accusation. "It matters," Ezekiel said quickly. "Too quickly. You matter." She searched his face, cautious, wounded. "Do I?" she asked. Ezekiel's throat tightened. He had no grand speech, no polished apology, only the truth raw and imperfect. "I was wrong," he said, "about everything." Maggie looked away, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the faintest hint of light had begun to gather. She did not respond. Silence settled again, heavy but honest. Ezekiel did not push. He stayed where he was, letting the quiet exist between them. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that some wounds could not be healed with words alone. As dawn broke pale light spilling into the room, Ezekiel felt a shift, not relief, but resolve. The night had stripped him bare, forced him to confront the man he had been, and the cost of becoming him. Whatever came next, judgment, forgiveness, or something in between, he would face it without hiding, because the silence of that night had shown him something he could no longer deny. Love was not loud. It did not demand or mock. It stayed. And for the first time in his life, Ezekiel Brown was ready to learn how. Morning came softly, as if the world itself feared making too much noise. Pale light filtered through the thin curtains, settling across the bed, where Maggie lay awake, eyes open, breathing steadier than it had been through the night. The pain in her side remained a dull, persistent ache, but the sharp terror of the collapse had faded into something quieter, something heavier. Ezekiel had not moved from his place beside her. He rose only to fetch water, to warm a cloth, to make himself useful in small, careful ways. Each task felt unfamiliar, like learning a new language through gestures alone. He did not speak much. He did not trust himself to. Maggie watched him from beneath lowered lashes. She noticed the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled when he set things down. This was not the Ezekiel she knew, the distant, impatient man who filled rooms with his silence. This Ezekiel seemed unsure of his place, as though standing on ground that might give way beneath him. When he finally sat again, she spoke. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said quietly. Ezekiel's head lifted. "To what?" She turned her gaze toward the window. "To you having to see me fall apart." The words were calm, almost gentle. That frightened him more than anger would have. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. "I should have." She shook her head slowly. "You wouldn't have. Not then." Ezekiel frowned, confusion creasing his brow. "There are things people don't see." Maggie continued, her voice steady, though her hands lay clenched in the blanket. "Not because they're hidden, but because seeing them would mean changing." Silence followed her words, thick and deliberate. Ezekiel felt them settle into him, uncomfortable and undeniable. "I was tired long before I fell," Maggie said. "Not just in my body, in my spirit." Ezekiel swallowed hard. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. "Why didn't you say something?" She let out a small, humorless breath. "I did, just not with words." He looked up at her, then truly looked. He saw the weariness etched into her face, the caution in her eyes. He saw how much of herself she had learned to hide, simply to survive. "I was afraid," she went on. "Afraid if I spoke too loudly, you'd turn away completely." The admission landed between them like a fragile object neither dared touch. Ezekiel closed his eyes briefly, shame burning behind them. He remembered every time he had dismissed her, laughed, along with others, stepped ahead of her in public. He remembered how easy it had been to believe her silence meant she could endure anything. "I never meant to break you," he said quietly. "I know," Maggie replied. "That's what hurts the most." Her honesty stripped away his last defense. Ezekiel had told himself that cruelty required intention, that harm came from deliberate malice. Maggie's words shattered that belief. He saw now that neglect could wound just as deeply. "I thought," she said slowly, "that if I worked harder, loved quieter, took up less space, maybe you'd find a way to love me." The confession settled heavily in the room. Ezekiel felt something inside him twist painfully. "I didn't know how," he said. "I didn't know how to love anyone, not properly." She studied him, weighing the truth in his words. "That doesn't make it easier," she said, "but it makes it clearer." They sat with that clarity for a long time. Outside, the day stretched forward indifferent to their reckoning. Ezekiel felt the urge to speak, to apologize fully, to promise change. But something held him back, not fear but understanding. Words alone would not bridge the distance he had built over years. "There were days," Maggie said softly, "when I wondered if disappearing would make things easier for you." The thought struck him like a physical blow. "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "Don't say that." She met his gaze unflinching. "I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true." Ezekiel pressed his hands together, knuckles whitening. He wanted to deny it, to argue, but denial had no place here. He had created a world where her absence felt imaginable. "I don't want you to disappear," he said finally. "I don't want a life without you." Maggie's expression softened slightly, but caution remained. Wanting isn't the same as knowing how to keep someone. He nodded. "I'm learning that." Another silence followed, less tense this time, but still uncertain. Maggie shifted carefully, wincing as pain flared in her side. Ezekiel stood immediately, adjusting the pillows, offering water. She accepted, her movements slow but deliberate. As she drank, Ezekiel watched her with a new awareness. He saw strength not in her endurance alone, but in her willingness to speak now, to risk honesty when silence would be safer. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for," he said quietly. She lowered the cup. "I shouldn't have had to be." The truth of that statement settled deep. By late morning, Ezekiel prepared to ride into town for help. He hesitated at the door, glancing back at Maggie. "I'll be back," he said. "I won't be long." She nodded. "I know." He paused, then added, "When I come back, if you're willing, I'd like to talk more." Maggie considered this, her expression thoughtful. "We'll see," she said gently. The words were not a promise. They were not a refusal. They were something in between, and Ezekiel understood that was all he had earned. As he stepped outside, the sun already climbing, Ezekiel felt the weight of the path ahead. Redemption, he realized, was not a moment but a process, one that demanded patience, humility, and consistency. Behind him, Maggie lay quietly staring at the ceiling. She felt exposed lighter and heavier all at once. Speaking the truth had eased something inside her, but it had also opened wounds she did not yet know how to tend. Neither of them knew what would come next. But one thing was certain: the silence that had once protected their marriage could no longer hold it together. And whatever followed this confession, whether healing or heartbreak, it would demand more courage than either of them had ever been asked to show. The road into town felt longer than it ever had. Ezekiel Brown rode with his head down, dust clinging to his boots, the rhythm of the horse's hooves echoing the thoughts he could no longer outrun. The morning sun rose higher, warming his back, but he felt cold all the same. He had spent his life believing that forward motion was the only cure for pain. Keep moving, keep working, never look back. But Maggie's words, quiet, steady, unyielding, had cracked that belief wide open. They followed him now, riding alongside every memory he had buried beneath labor and pride. Ezekiel had not always been a hard man. That truth surfaced reluctantly, like a wound reopening. He remembered his father first, a tall, gaunt figure bent beneath years of failed crops and unpaid debts. The man had spoken little, laughed less, and carried disappointment like a permanent shadow. Ezekiel learned early that affection was scarce, and praise even scarcer. Mistakes were noticed immediately. Effort was expected, never acknowledged. His mother had been softer, but illness took her before softness could leave a lasting mark. After her death, the house grew quieter, colder. Ezekiel learned to measure his worth by how much he could endure without complaint. When his father died, Ezekiel inherited more than land. He inherited fear, fear of failure, fear of dependence, fear of being seen as weak. He buried that fear beneath relentless work, convinced that toughness was the only currency that mattered. But toughness had never brought him peace. By the time he reached town, Ezekiel felt wrung out, his thoughts tangled and raw. He tied his horse and stepped inside the general store, the familiar smells of grain and oil grounding him momentarily. Conversations hushed when he entered. A few men nodded, others glanced away. Caleb Turner leaned against the counter, his grin quick to appear. "Fields still look thirsty," he said lightly. Ezekiel did not respond. The silence surprised Caleb more than anger would have. Ezekiel turned instead toward old Silas Boone, who sat near the window, his weathered hands resting on a cane. Silas had lived long enough to know when a man's silence carried weight. "Silas," Ezekiel said, "I need a doctor, or anyone who knows something about injuries." Silas's eyes sharpened. "What happened?" "My wife fell," Ezekiel replied. "She's hurt." There was no mockery in Silas's gaze, only understanding. He nodded once. "I'll come." They rode back together in silence, Silas's presence steady and grounding. Ezekiel felt exposed under the older man's watchful eyes, as though Silas could see straight through the layers Ezekiel had built around himself. Inside the house, Silas examined Maggie carefully, his movements gentle, respectful. He spoke little, but his face told Ezekiel enough. "She's worn down," Silas said finally. "Overworked, undernourished." That fall didn't help, but it wasn't the start of this. Ezekiel nodded, shame tightening his chest. When Silas finished, he lingered, his gaze settling on Ezekiel with quiet intensity. "You don't look surprised," he said. "I'm not," Ezekiel admitted. Silas studied him for a long moment. "Then maybe it's time you asked yourself why." The question followed Ezekiel long after Silas left. That afternoon, while Maggie rested, Ezekiel stepped outside and sat on the porch, staring out at the land he had fought so hard to control. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his past, fully to trace the line from a childhood of silent endurance to the man he had become. He had mocked Maggie not because she was weak, but because she reminded him of everything he feared becoming: visible, vulnerable, judged. In diminishing her, he had tried to elevate himself. The realization burned. He thought of all the ways he had learned cruelty without ever being taught kindness, of how easily he had accepted pain as a given, of how that acceptance had bled into his marriage, turning survival into a substitute for love. When Maggie woke later that day, Ezekiel was there. He did not rush to speak. He waited. "I was raised to believe that needing someone was dangerous," he said finally. "That showing softness meant giving the world something it could use against you." Maggie listened quietly. "I didn't know how to be different," he continued, "so I chose distance. I chose jokes. I chose silence." She said nothing, but her eyes did not leave his. "I see now what that cost you," Ezekiel said, "and what it nearly cost me." Maggie shifted, slightly wincing, but remained focused. "Understanding where it came from doesn't undo it," she said gently. "I know," he replied, "but I need you to know that I see it now. I see you." The words hung between them, fragile and uncertain. Outside, the land remained dry. The future remained unclear. Ezekiel did not pretend that one night or one confession could repair years of harm, but something fundamental had changed. He no longer wanted to be the man his past had shaped him into. As evening approached, Ezekiel prepared supper himself, simple, awkward, but sincere. Maggie watched from the bed, surprise flickering across her tired face. He did not comment on her eating, did not rush her, did not fill the air with forced conversation. He stayed, and in that quiet persistence, Maggie felt the faintest shift, no promise of healing, but the possibility of it. Ezekiel sat with her as the sun dipped, low shadows stretching across the room. He did not know what redemption would demand of him, only that it would require facing his past honestly and choosing again and again to act differently. For the first time in his life, Ezekiel Brown understood that love was not about strength displayed outwardly. It was about humility, about seeing clearly, and about carrying another person's pain without turning away. The reckoning had begun. Change did not arrive in Ezekiel Brown like a sudden storm. It crept in quietly, almost unnoticed, settling into his days the way dusk settled over the fields, slow, deliberate, impossible to rush. After Silas Boone's visit, Ezekiel did not make grand declarations. He did not beg forgiveness or promise to be a better man by tomorrow. He had learned enough by now to understand that words, when offered too easily, could become another kind of cruelty. Instead, he chose something far harder. He chose consistency. Each morning, Ezekiel rose before Maggie. He prepared water, warmed it carefully, and set it by her bed before stepping outside. He checked on her first, always first, asking how she felt, listening without interruption when she answered. When she winced in pain, he noticed. When she tired, he adjusted. These were small acts, but they carried a weight Maggie felt deeply. At first, she did not trust them. Years of neglect had taught her caution. Kindness that arrived too suddenly often disappeared just as fast. Maggie watched Ezekiel closely, measuring his actions against memory. She did not meet his gaze often. She did not thank him. She accepted his help quietly, guarding herself against hope. Ezekiel did not press. He learned how to cook simple meals without comment. He learned how to clean without complaint. He learned how to sit beside her in silence without filling the space with excuses. When Maggie struggled to stand, he offered his arm not insistently, but steadily. If she refused, he stepped back without resentment. Each choice cost him something. Pride, he realized, had once given him a sense of control. Letting go of it left him exposed, unsure of himself, in ways he had not felt since boyhood. But he reminded himself daily that discomfort was not danger. It was growth. The town noticed the change before Maggie did. When Ezekiel brought supplies home himself rather than sending Maggie into town, whispers followed him. When he spoke less and listened more, men like Caleb Turner grew uneasy. Familiar patterns had been disrupted, and not everyone welcomed that. One afternoon, Caleb made a remark about Maggie's absence from town. Keeping her hidden now, he asked with a grin. Ezekiel met his gaze steadily. "She's recovering," he said, "and that's none of your concern." The words were calm, measured. No joke followed. The silence that settled afterward felt heavier than laughter ever had. Maggie heard about the exchange later from Eliza Hartwell. She said nothing in response, but something inside her shifted. It was not relief, not forgiveness. It was recognition. Ezekiel was choosing differently, especially when no reward followed. Days passed. Maggie grew stronger, though recovery came slowly. Pain lingered, reminding her of how close she had come to losing herself entirely. Ezekiel did not rush her progress. He adjusted the workload, took on tasks she once shouldered alone, and accepted help from others without protest. That last part surprised her most. One evening, as they sat together watching the light fade through the window, Maggie spoke quietly. "You've never asked for help before." Ezekiel nodded. "I thought it meant failure, and now I think refusing it nearly cost me everything." She studied him, then searching for the familiar hardness, the defensiveness she had grown used to navigating. It was still there in fragments, but something else existed alongside it now. Humility, uncertainty, a willingness to be changed. That frightened her almost as much as it moved her. Maggie had survived by learning not to hope too deeply. Hope, she knew, could become a trap if offered too freely. So she remained careful, allowing Ezekiel's actions to stand on their own without attaching expectations. One night, Ezekiel brought a blanket and sat beside her on the porch, neither of them speaking for a long time. The stars appeared slowly scattered across the darkening sky. "I don't know how to fix what I broke," he said finally. Maggie considered her response carefully. "Fixing it might not be possible," she said, "but tending to it is." He nodded, accepting the truth without argument. From that moment on, Ezekiel measured his days not by outcomes, but by effort. Did he show up? Did he listen? Did he choose respect when mockery would have been easier? These questions guided him more reliably than pride ever had. Still, doubt lingered. There were moments, quiet, unguarded moments, when Ezekiel feared it was too late. When Maggie's guarded expression reminded him of the distance he had built so carefully over years. He did not blame her for it. If anything, it fueled his resolve. Maggie, for her part, wrestled with emotions she had long buried. Gratitude warred with resentment. Relief clashed with grief for the years she had lost. She wondered if she could ever trust this new version of Ezekiel, or if trusting him would mean risking herself all over again. She did not yet have an answer. What she did know was this: the man before her now was different from the one who had mocked her so casually. And difference, when sustained, had the power to change more than circumstances. As autumn approached, the drought loosened its grip slightly. A light rain fell one evening, brief, but enough to scent the air with promise. Ezekiel stood in it silently, letting the water soak into his clothes, his hair, his skin. He felt smaller beneath the sky and strangely more grounded. When he returned inside, Maggie was watching from the doorway. "It rained," he said. "I know," she replied softly. They shared a look, not triumphant, not hopeful, but real. Two people standing in the aftermath of something painful, uncertain of what would grow next. Ezekiel did not reach for her. He did not rush the moment. He simply stood with her, allowing the quiet to exist without fear. Change, he was learning, did not announce itself loudly. It revealed itself through patience, through restraint, through the courage to remain present, even when forgiveness was not guaranteed. And for the first time, Maggie allowed herself to believe just a little that what she was witnessing was not an apology performed, but a life being reshaped. Still, the future remained unwritten, because the true test of change was not how it appeared in moments of calm, but how it endured when challenged. And that challenge was coming. The town did not change with Ezekiel Brown. Towns rarely did. They were slow creatures built on habit and repetition, sustained by shared stories that people told themselves about one another. And when someone stepped outside those stories, the town noticed. At first, it was small things. A pause in conversation when Ezekiel entered the general store. A look exchanged between men who once laughed easily at his jokes. The absence of familiar nods. Ezekiel felt it immediately, though he pretended not to. He had spent years cultivating belonging through mockery. Abandoning it left him standing alone. Caleb Turner felt the shift most keenly. Caleb had thrived on the unspoken hierarchy of the place. He knew how to stay just above the line, never the poorest, never the most mocked. Ezekiel's old humor had been useful to him. It gave shape to cruelty without requiring ownership. Now, with Ezekiel no longer playing his part, Caleb felt exposed. One afternoon, as Ezekiel loaded supplies onto his wagon, Caleb leaned nearby and said loudly, "Funny how some men forget who they are once they start hiding behind a woman." The words carried intended for an audience. A few men snorted. Others waited, eyes flicking to Ezekiel, anticipating the familiar response, the sharp remark, the laugh that would pull everyone back into place. Ezekiel did not laugh. He tightened the rope on the wagon and turned slowly to face Caleb. His expression was calm, almost weary. "I'm not hiding," he said. "I'm standing where I should have been all along." Caleb scoffed. "Defending her now, that's rich." Something in Ezekiel's chest tightened, not anger, but clarity. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind without realizing it. He knew what he would say because the truth no longer needed dressing. "You don't get to speak about my wife?" Ezekiel replied, "Not like that. Not at all." The silence that followed was sharp. It cut through the dusty air, more unsettling than laughter ever had been. Caleb's grin faltered, replaced by irritation. "Since when do you grow a spine?" Caleb muttered. "Since I learned what it costs not to," Ezekiel said. He climbed onto the wagon and drove away, leaving behind the whispers that rose as soon as he was gone. The price of that moment followed him home. Over the next weeks, Ezekiel found doors closing. Credit he once relied on was suddenly unavailable. Offers of shared labor disappeared. Men who had once stood beside him in quiet camaraderie now kept their distance. Ezekiel felt the sting of exclusion keenly, but this time he recognized it for what it was. It was the same pain Maggie had carried for years. He did not complain to her. He did not burden her with his frustration. Instead, he adjusted. He worked longer hours. He accepted help from unexpected places. Eliza Hartwell, old Silas Boone, even Reverend Jonathan Miller, who stopped by one afternoon with a sack of supplies and a steady look that said everything without words. Maggie noticed the change in the air around Ezekiel before she understood its cause. He returned home quieter, more tired, but also more resolved. When she asked gently if something was wrong, he did not brush her off. "They're not pleased with me," he said simply. For what, she asked, for not being who they preferred. She studied him carefully. "And who is that?" "The man who laughed." "When they laughed," he replied, "the man who made things easier for them." Maggie nodded slowly. "And that man is gone." Ezekiel met her gaze. "He has to be." The admission carried weight. Maggie felt it settle in her chest, heavy and warm all at once. She had imagined many things, apologies, promises, even grand gestures. She had not imagined this Ezekiel choosing discomfort, choosing isolation, choosing her, when it cost him something tangible. Still, trust did not rush in. There were moments when Maggie caught herself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the frustration to turn inward, for the resentment to find its old shape. She watched Ezekiel closely, measuring his patience, his restraint. When the town mocked him indirectly, he absorbed it without redirecting the pain toward her. That mattered. One evening, Caleb Turner appeared at the edge of their property, his posture loose, his expression sharp. Maggie saw him first and felt her body tense instinctively. Ezekiel followed her gaze and stepped outside before she could speak. They stood a short distance apart, the space between them charged. "You're making things difficult," Caleb said. Ezekiel crossed his arms. "For you." "For everyone," Caleb corrected. "This place runs on understanding. You're breaking it." Ezekiel shook his head. "No, I'm breaking your comfort." Caleb's eyes flicked toward the house, toward Maggie's silhouette in the doorway. "She's not worth all this trouble." The words hung there, ugly and familiar. Ezekiel did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply said, "Leave." Caleb laughed once bitterly. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Ezekiel replied, "but not for the reasons you think." Caleb left without another word. Maggie stood quietly as Ezekiel returned inside. She searched his face, looking for cracks for the anger that used to follow confrontation. She found none, only exhaustion and something steadier beneath it. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes," he replied. "I did." They sat together that night in silence, the kind that no longer felt punishing. Maggie thought about all the times Ezekiel had chosen the town over her, the laughter over her dignity. She felt grief for those years, grief that would not disappear simply because things were changing now. But she also felt something new: balance. Ezekiel was no longer asking her to carry the cost of belonging alone. As winter edged closer, the town's judgment hardened, then dulled into routine. Ezekiel learned to navigate without its approval. He found a strange freedom in it, lonely, yes, but honest. Maggie, watching from the quiet safety of her recovery, began to see the shape of a different future, not perfect, not easy, but grounded in mutual regard. One night, as the wind rattled the windows, Maggie spoke the truth she had been holding back. "I don't know if I can forgive everything," she said. Ezekiel nodded. "I know, but I can see what you're choosing now," she continued. "And that matters." He met her gaze, steady and unguarded. "I'll keep choosing it," he said, "whether you forgive me or not." The words were not a plea. They were a commitment. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the old voices of the town across the plains. Inside, something quieter and more resilient was taking root, because when a man accepts the cost of his past cruelty without demanding absolution, he begins to understand the weight of true change. And Ezekiel Brown was learning one difficult day at a time that love did not shield you from consequence. It asked you to bear it. Winter approached without ceremony. The nights grew longer, the air sharper, and the land settled into a brittle stillness that mirrored the tension inside the Brown household. Maggie had recovered enough to move freely again, though the memory of her collapse lingered in the careful way she lifted things, the pauses she allowed herself now without apology. Ezekiel watched those pauses with a mix of gratitude and regret. Gratitude that she was alive, regret that it had taken a breaking point for him to notice how much she carried. The town's distance had become a constant. Supplies cost more. Work came harder. Ezekiel felt the consequences of his choices daily pressing against him like cold wind through thin walls. He did not complain, not to Maggie, not to anyone. Complaints, he had learned, were a luxury he could not afford. But choice, he realized, was not a single moment. It was something that returned each day, demanding to be made again. The test came when old Silas Boone arrived one afternoon with news Ezekiel had feared. A larger farm owner from the next county was offering to buy out smaller properties, Ezekiel's included. The price was low, insultingly low, but it came with security, steady work, credit restored, and a return to the town's good graces. "There's a condition," Silas said quietly, his eyes serious. "He wants you alone. No complications." Ezekiel understood immediately what that meant. The farm owner had made his opinion known more than once. Maggie's presence was considered a liability, bad for appearances, bad for business. If Ezekiel accepted the message was clear, life would go on more easily. If Maggie faded quietly into the background, or disappeared altogether. That evening, Ezekiel sat at the table long after Maggie finished her meal. Fall. The offer weighed heavily on him, its temptation sharpened by fear. Security, belonging, relief from judgment. Everything he had chased for years lay within reach. At a cost. Maggie noticed his silence. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then told her the truth. All of it. She listened without interruption, her face unreadable. When he finished, the room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls themselves were waiting for her response. "And what do you think?" she asked softly. Ezekiel stared down at his hands. "I think it would make things easier. For you," she said. "Yes, and harder for me." He looked up then, meeting her gaze. "I won't do it," he said quickly. "I won't trade you for comfort." Maggie studied him carefully. That wasn't the question. He frowned. "Then what is, whether you would still choose me," she said, "if I asked you not to?" The words landed with quiet force. Ezekiel's chest tightened. He had not expected this turn. "Why would you ask that?" he said. "Because I need to know," Maggie replied. "Not that you'll defend me when it costs you pride, but when it costs you everything else." He searched her face, seeing the fear she tried so hard to hide. Years of being diminished had taught her to expect sacrifice to fall unevenly. "I won't take the offer," Ezekiel said again, slower now. "Not if it means losing you. Not if it means returning to who I was. Maggie shook her head gently. I'm not asking you to prove yourself. I'm asking you to choose honestly. Silence stretched between them. Ezekiel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening land. He thought of the boy he had been learning early that survival meant endurance. He thought of the man he had become, hardened, mocking, afraid. And he thought of the man he was trying to be, now uncertain but willing. He turned back to Maggie. I choose you, he said simply, not because I owe you, but because I want a life that doesn't require me to shrink someone else to stand tall. Maggie closed her eyes, briefly absorbing the words. When she opened them again, something had shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but release. Then I choose myself, she said. Ezekiel stiffened. What do you mean? Maggie continued carefully, that I won't stay where my presence is treated as a problem to be managed. Fear surged through him. Are you leaving? I don't know, she answered honestly. I need time, space. I need to learn who I am without measuring myself against your choices. The possibility struck him hard, but he did not argue. He did not plead. He had learned that love, if it was real, did not cling. If you go, he said quietly, I won't stop you. She studied him, searching for resentment, for anger, finding none. That's the first time you've ever said something like that, she noted. It's the first time I've meant it, he replied. The next morning, Maggie packed a small bag. She planned to stay with Eliza Hartwell for a while, long enough to breathe without the weight of expectation. Ezekiel helped without comment, folding clothes carefully, setting aside the things she would need. At the door, she paused. I don't know what this means for us, she said. Neither do I, Ezekiel replied. But whatever it is, it won't be built on silence. She nodded once, then stepped outside. Ezekiel watched her walk down the path, her back straight, her pace steady. The house felt emptier immediately, but not hollow. Something had been stripped away. Yes, but something truer remained. Later that day, Ezekiel rode into town and declined the offer. The reaction was swift and cold. Doors closed more firmly now. Whispers sharpened into judgment. Ezekiel felt the loss keenly, but he did not waver. He had made his choice. That night alone in the house, Ezekiel sat by the window and let the silence wash over him. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of accountability. Maggie, miles away, sat in Eliza's small kitchen holding a cup of warm tea. She felt fear, yes, but also a cautious hope. For the first time, her future did not hinge on enduring someone else's disregard. 2 lives had shifted that day. Not neatly, not cleanly, but irrevocably. Because some choices do not lead to immediate reward. They lead to truth. And once truth is chosen, there is no going back. The house learned how to be quiet after Maggie left. Not the brittle quiet of tension, nor the hollow silence of neglect, but a living quiet, one that echoed with memory and expectation. Ezekiel Brown woke each morning to it, the space beside him, cool the routines he had rebuilt, now stripped to their simplest form. He did not rush to fill the hours. He let them be what they were, honest. He worked the land alone, accepting what it offered and what it refused. He spoke less to the sky and more to the ground, tending what could still grow with patience rather than force. When neighbors passed, he nodded politely. When doors closed, he kept walking. The loss of approval hurt, but it did not hollow him the way it once would have. In town, word traveled quickly. Some called him stubborn. Others called him foolish. A few quietly called him changed. Ezekiel did not correct them. Change, he had learned, did not need defending. Maggie stayed with Eliza Hartwell longer than she first intended. The small house held warmth, without demand, conversation, without judgment. Eliza asked questions when invited and offered silence when needed. Together they cooked mended bread by lamplight. Maggie felt herself breathing more deeply than she had in years. For the first time, she moved through days without anticipating someone else's reaction to her presence. She noticed small things about herself, how she preferred mornings, how she enjoyed walking slowly, how her body felt when she rested without guilt. She found strength not in endurance now, but in discernment, in choosing when to give and when to stop. And yet Ezekiel remained with her in memory, in question, in the quiet tug of unfinished truth. They did not speak often. Ezekiel sent brief notes when there was news of the farm. Maggie responded when she wished. Neither demanded more. The space between them was not punishment. It was permission. Winter loosened its grip as spring crept in. The air softened. The land breathed again. Ezekiel noticed small signs of renewal, a green blade here, a bud there, and tended them with care. He found himself thinking of Maggie, not as she had been worn, diminished, but as she was becoming whole. One afternoon, Eliza received a letter. She read it twice before handing it to Maggie. "It's from Ezekiel," she said gently. Maggie took it, her fingers steady. She read slowly. He did not apologize. He did not plead. He wrote of the land, of the weather, of how he had learned to wait without resentment. He wrote of mistakes without defending them. He wrote of hope without asking for it. At the end, he wrote simply, "I am here, however you choose." Maggie folded the letter carefully and sat for a long time. That evening, she spoke aloud what she had been holding inside. "I don't want to return to who I was," she said. Eliza nodded. "Then don't." "I don't want to disappear into someone else's life," Maggie continued. "Even his." "Then don't," Eliza said again. Maggie smiled faintly. "But I don't want to keep running from something that's changing either." Eliza studied her with quiet approval. "Then go see it for yourself." The decision did not arrive like a revelation. It came like a settling, gentle shore. Maggie returned to the farm on a clear morning, the sun high, the road familiar beneath her feet. Ezekiel was in the field when he saw her bent over young shoots, his movements unhurried. He straightened slowly as if afraid that moving too quickly might break the moment. They stood facing each other, the land stretching wide around them. "You came," he said. "Yes," she replied. They did not embrace. They did not rush. They walked together toward the house, step by careful step. Inside, everything felt the same and different. Maggie noticed the order, the effort, the absence of expectation. They sat at the table, sunlight spilling between them. "I don't know what this means," Maggie said. "Neither do I," Ezekiel replied. "But I won't decide it for you." She nodded. "I won't disappear for you. I don't want you to," he said quietly. "I want to meet you where you are." The words were not polished. They were not romantic, but they were real. Days passed. Maggie stayed not as she had before, but as herself. She worked when she wished, rested when she needed. Ezekiel followed her lead, not out of fear, but respect. He asked rather than assumed. He listened rather than reacted. In town, their presence together drew attention. Ezekiel did not shield Maggie from it, but neither did he abandon her to it. He stood beside her openly without apology. When mockery surfaced, he addressed it plainly. When kindness appeared, he welcomed it. Maggie felt seen, not spotlighted, not exposed, but recognized. One evening, as they walked the edge of the field, Maggie spoke softly. "You once laughed because you didn't know how else to belong." Ezekiel nodded. "I thought belonging required agreement." "And now," she asked. "Now, I think it requires integrity," he replied. She considered that, then smiled. It was small but unguarded. Love did not arrive as a rush. It settled slowly like light through a window long kept closed. It revealed rather than overwhelmed. It asked rather than demanded. Maggie did not forget the past. Ezekiel did not erase it. They carried it together, not as a weapon, but as a teacher. When Ezekiel reached for her hand one evening, he did so with hesitation. Maggie looked at him, then placed her hand in his. Not as surrender, as choice. In the quiet that followed, the farm felt different, not redeemed, not perfect, but honest. Two people standing fully in their own lives, choosing to walk forward together without pretending the road had been easy. Because love, when finally seen, does not arrive disguised as sacrifice. It arrives as recognition, and for the first time, both Ezekiel and Maggie knew what it meant to be truly known. Spring did not transform the land all at once. It never did. The plains changed slowly, almost shyly, as if unsure whether they were welcome to bloom again. Ezekiel Brown learned to live by that rhythm now, patient, observant, willing to wait without demanding proof. So did Maggie. Their life together did not return to what it had been. It could not. Too much truth had passed between them for that. Instead, something quieter took shape, less visible from the road, but stronger at its core. Maggie no longer measured her worth by how much she endured. She chose her work deliberately, pacing herself, resting when her body asked for it without apology. Some days she worked beside Ezekiel in the fields. Other days she stayed near the house, sewing, reading, or simply sitting in the sun with a cup of tea, breathing deeply. Ezekiel noticed everything. He noticed how her laughter returned not often but honestly. He noticed how she met people's eyes now, unflinching. He noticed how the space she occupied no longer felt like something she was trying to apologize for. And he learned slowly how to stand with her without trying to shape her. In town, the whispers softened into something else. Curiosity replaced mockery. Some neighbors never warmed to them, holding on to old judgments like familiar tools. But others, especially the women, began to look at Maggie differently. They asked her opinion. They listened when she spoke. Maggie did not seek their approval, but she accepted their recognition. Ezekiel's standing never fully recovered, and he no longer chased it. He worked harder, lived leaner, and found satisfaction in smaller victories: a repaired fence, a modest harvest, a shared meal at the end of a long day. He learned that dignity did not come from laughter earned at someone else's expense. One afternoon, as they sat together watching the fields, Maggie spoke the truth she had carried quietly for weeks. "I loved you once," she said, "before I knew how much that love would cost me." Ezekiel did not flinch. He waited. "And I love you differently now," she continued, with my eyes open. He nodded. "That's the only kind I deserve." She smiled softly. "That's the only kind I'm willing to give." There were moments when the past resurfaced unexpected sharp. A careless remark from a stranger, a memory stirred by laughter in the distance. In those moments, Maggie did not retreat. She spoke, and Ezekiel listened, without defense, without excuses. Healing, they learned, was not about forgetting. It was about responding differently. One evening, Reverend Jonathan Miller stopped by bringing bread and quiet company. As they spoke, he observed them carefully, his gaze thoughtful. "You've both changed," he said finally. Maggie tilted her head. "So have you," she replied gently. He smiled. "That's often how it works." After he left, Ezekiel and Maggie sat together beneath the darkening sky. Stars emerged one by one, scattered across the vastness above them. "I used to think strength meant never bending," Ezekiel said. "And now," Maggie asked, "now I think it means knowing when to," he replied. She reached for his hand, not tentatively this time, but with quiet confidence. He took it, his grip steady but gentle. Their love did not erase the scars. It did not promise ease or permanence. It promised something far more difficult and far more real: presence. Years later, people would remember them in fragments. Some would speak of the farmer who changed, others of the woman who stood taller than anyone expected. Few would know the full story: the long silences, the painful reckonings, the choices that cost more than comfort. But Ezekiel and Maggie would know. They would know that love had not come to them as rescue or reward. It had arrived as responsibility, as humility, as the courage to see and be seen without turning away. And that was enough. Because a life lived without shadow, even if smaller, harder, quieter, was richer than any life built on mockery and fear. As the night settled over the plains, Maggie leaned her head against Ezekiel's shoulder. He did not stiffen. He did not pull away. He rested there with her, grounded in the simple truth that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Love was never about who the world approved of. It was about who you chose to honor again and again when no one else was watching. This story reminds us that the deepest wounds are not always caused by violence or cruelty shouted aloud, but by quiet neglect, careless words, and love withheld. True harm often hides behind jokes, habits, and silence until one day the weight becomes too heavy to carry. Yet this story also shows us something equally powerful: people can change, but only when they are brave enough to face their own flaws without excuses. Real love is not about possession, appearance, or social approval. It is about seeing another human being fully and choosing respect even when it costs pride, comfort, or belonging. And just as importantly, this story teaches that self-worth must come before forgiveness. Love that heals does not demand endurance. It grows from mutual dignity, honesty, and choice. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever been unseen, or realized too late that someone needed you to truly look? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if stories like this move you, please subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt, meaningful journeys from the past.